Hi, thank you for joining us today for our webinar on the link between sugar and heart disease. I'm Dr. Munsch Dal Farra, and I wanted to take this opportunity of our time together to discuss carbohydrates in more depth. There's a lot of hype in the wellness community about carbohydrates and their link to heart disease and weight. But in order to really understand what is a carbohydrate and how does it impact our health, we're going to need to get granular and look at a carbohydrate in more detail and understand its molecular makeup. A carbohydrate in its most basic state is a sugar. A sugar is a single unit of a mixture of carbon atoms and hydrogen and oxygen. And I don't want to get too detailed and bore you, but some simple sugar examples that we know and experience every day are things like glucose, fructose, and galactose. So carbohydrate in its most basic state is a sugar molecule. And these sugar molecules can group together into either simple or complex carbohydrates. A simple carbohydrate is one sugar molecule or two sugar molecules that are linked together. And a complex carbohydrate is when you have a string of these different types of sugar molecules linked together. So our most basic example is table sugar. In that instance, you have two molecules that are linked together, one of glucose and one of fructose. We hear about sugars all the time. So simple monosaccharides, which is one unit of sugar, mono being one and saccharide is a unit of sugar, are things like our glucose, fructose, galactose, mannose, and ribose. And then those come together and something like glucose and fructose forms sucrose, or fructose and galactose forms lactose. And then you can get even longer chains of these molecules, and those start becoming complex carbohydrates or starches or fibers, we refer to them as. So every time we talk in food and nutrition about things like sugars or starch or fiber, all of these things are under the category of carbohydrates, and they just alter in their complexity of how many molecules are joined together. So simple carbohydrates, things that are just made of one or two molecules, are much more easily processed by the body, and they're called our rapid sugars. And our complex carbohydrates, which are our longer chains of sugars, are called complex carbohydrates, and they take much longer to be fully absorbed by the body. But both simple and complex carbs are turned into glucose in the body, and they're used as our main energy source. They're used by the brain. And what's really important about these carbohydrates is that they also regulate our temperature. And so they help the body maintain a constant temperature. So what we know about carbohydrates is they are essential parts of our diet, and they're essential to the healthy functioning of all of our cells and all of our organs. So when we think about carbohydrates and we think about our food plan, we don't want to think to ourselves that carbohydrates are the enemy. In fact, carbohydrates make up some of the most healthy foods that we can incorporate into our diet. So all of our fruits, which come in the more basic component of our carbohydrates, those fructose type sugars, those are all carbohydrates. And then as those chains get more and more complex, they form more of our starchy vegetables like beets and turnips and artichokes and asparagus. And then you also have our whole grains like peas and lentils and legumes, which are even longer and more complex chains of carbohydrates. So all of those are carbohydrates, and they're all very healthy and very important for our diet and our food plan. Other foods that fall under the category of carbohydrates are things like pastas and white bread and croissant and all these Danish and pastries. And very often in our modern day society, when we think of carbohydrates, that's what we start associating the foods with carbohydrates, because these are the foods that are more frequently looked at, thought about, and we are told to eliminate them when we're on a diet. So what's important about these carbohydrates is they start to become modified from their natural state. They start to have things like butter and salt and oil added into them. and then also artificial sweeteners, until so much of these foods have been processed that we basically have turned them into a dessert. So we're then talking about things like Fruit Loops and sugary cereals and granola bars, salad dressings, and ketchup and barbecue sauce, and these things that start sneaking into our everyday pantry, but they've been very altered from their natural state. And these are the carbohydrates that are important to limit in our diet. So as we're looking at these carbohydrates and we're trying to think about, how do they impact us at a metabolic level, we think about how fast does this food raise our blood sugar? How fast is your blood sugar going to raise over a 2-hour period of time once you eat this food? And we have a system called the Glycemic Index, which is used to classify food in terms of how fast will these foods raise our blood sugar. So something with a low glycemic index is a food that has less than 50. And that means that in less than 2 hours, only 50% of that food's sugar is going to pass into your bloodstream. Something with a high glycemic index is over 70. So that means that food is going to cause a rapid secretion of insulin after ingestion, and that over 70% of that food sugar is going to pass into the bloodstream. And why this is important is because the higher the glycemic index is, the higher it raises our blood sugar, and then the higher it releases the hormones that also induce things like cravings for more food as soon as that sugar enters the actual cells. So things like your chips and biscuits and cakes and ice cream, and even things, certain fruits that have a lot of sugar content, like a watermelon, those are foods that are going to have a higher glycemic index. Foods like vegetables, non-starchy vegetables, like even asparagus and green beans and broccoli, all the way through peas and lentils and legumes and basmati rice, those are going to have a lower glycemic index. So over a 2-hour period of time, less of that sugar will be in your bloodstream. Here's a classification system of low, medium, and high glycemic index foods. And, you'll see that lower glycemic index foods are the lower starchy fruits, vegetables, and legumes and whole grains. And then that glycemic index moves up as you get into candies and white bread and white rice and biscuits and more of those processed type of foods. So our diet has changed so much over the last 50 years. And as we look at this graph, we can see just how much our sugar consumption has increased. And especially if we look at this graph, the lower corner, 1950 to 2000, we have a huge increase in the sugar consumption in our diet. We notice that also parallels the increase of obesity and the prevalence of obesity. And so we ask ourselves really, to understand this change in our diet and understand the impact on our health, we look at the overall calorie count too of the American diet. And from 1961 to 2011, we increased our calorie consumption by over 700 calories on average, the American diet did. And that purple aspect of the wheel shows how much added sugar per day we increased to. So we're consuming over a 4th cup of added sugar per day, more than we should, compared to the 6 to 9 teaspoons that are recommended by the American Heart Association. And so where's all this extra sugar coming from? And that's really something to take awareness of as we are looking at foods and looking at nutrition facts and labels on the foods that we're eating. And there's a new part of our nutrition fact label that's here, and it's circled in red here at the bottom, and it's underneath the sugar content, and it's called added sugars. And what this is telling us is beyond the food's natural state, how much sugar was added to the food that you're eating. And that's a really important piece of information to take note of, because that means that above and beyond the natural dietary fibers and sugars that exist within the food you're eating, during its processing and packaging, additional sugar was added. And in total, depending on if you're male or female, and it's less for females than males, that added sugar amount should be somewhere between 25 and 30 grams per day. So if you're looking at one serving of something and you see 25 added sugars, that's your total amount of added sugar that you should be consuming for the whole day. A big part of this added sugar is coming from high fructose corn syrup. And high fructose corn syrup is not a natural form of corn. It's a derivative of a corn product, and it's one of the most commonly added sugars into foods. And it exists in obvious places, like a Coca-Cola, for example, but it also exists in foods that we don't even realize that it snuck its way into. And so as we think about some of our foods and we think about where high fructose corn syrup has snuck in that's not obvious, it's in places like ketchup and barbecue sauce and some salad dressings, and even in certain granola bars and Pop-Tarts that we may eat or feed our kids for breakfast. So this is another important additive as you're looking at ingredients to understand, does the food I'm eating have this high fructose corn syrup in it? So one of the exercises that we can do is just kind of taking a look at everyday items and something like commercial barbecue sauce or Snickers, thinking about which of these items do we think has more added sugar in it. So a quarter cup of commercial barbecue sauce, something like Sweet Baby Ray's, contains more sugar than a regular size Snickers bar. So that's something to keep in mind. So when we drench our hamburger or our ribs with barbecue sauce, we're really adding a lot of flavoring that contains a lot of sugar to our meal. Something like French dressing in a Reese's peanut butter cup. How many of us think that the Reese's peanut butter cup has more sugar than French dressing? A quarter cup of Kraft French dressing contains as much sugar as a single Reese's peanut butter cup, which is about 12 grams of sugar. Another place that we might find this is in pasta sauce that we buy that is already jarred. So looking at a cup of Prego, a half cup of Prego compared to a couple of Oreo cookies. A half cup of Prego contains more sugar than 2 Oreo cookies. So these are places where sugar just sneaks in to our life. Jelly. Look at jelly compared to Skittles candy. 4 tablespoons of Smucker's grape jelly contains as much sugar as a 2-ounce bag of Skittles. So these aren't necessarily obvious foods, everyday pantry items like jam and salad dressing and barbecue sauce and ketchup, but they end up containing a lot of sugar that we don't even realize we're incorporating into our food. 6 rings of Dole pineapple rings compared to Chunky Monkey ice cream. 6 slices in heavy syrup contain as much sugar as a whole cup of Ben & Jerry's. So again, things that feel healthy or feel like an everyday item may just have lurking high fructose corn syrup or other artificial sweeteners that have increased its sugar content to the same amount as something that you would expect to have sugar in. The place that sugar really creeps into our diets is in our drinks and soft drinks and sodas. And so one of those places that always astounds me is how much sugar is in vitamin water and energy drinks and coffee drinks over the counter. And, you know, in vitamin water, you have nearly 27 grams of sugar, which is more than the average daily recommended amount of sugar to add. So when we're looking at those labels and we're thinking about sugar, and we're thinking about a healthy diet, eating carbohydrates and the natural sugars that come into those foods is important. But it's when sugar continues to get added to our foods that we start taking a risk. And that's where we need to start paying attention and growing an awareness of the foods that we're eating and how much of those foods contain added sugar amounts, and really trying to limit that to 24 grams for women and about 26 grams for men. What's interesting is understanding also why sugar has such an important impact on our health. And the association between sugar and heart disease and coronary artery disease, which is that plaque that builds up in our heart arteries, has been known for a long time. We started having research coming out about this in the 1950s. And what's interesting is that the sugar industry and the Sugar Research Foundation got its hand on that research and started funding studies that emphasized the risk of fat and cholesterol as being more important determinants of heart disease than sugar. And so in 2016, the Journal of the New England Journal of Medicine and JAMA, which are important medical journals, started advising policymakers to not take the advice of the food industry, of studies funded by the food industry, into consideration when making policy and health recommendations, because we've known that sugar does lead to heart disease and weight gain in its added form for a long time, but a lot of that information was really kept out of the public eye for a long time. What we know about sugar, and when we have an excess of sugar, is it leads to a number of conditions with our health. One of the most important areas where sugar influences us is in insulin resistance. And we're going to talk about more of that in a second. It leads to mitochondrial dysfunction. It leads to weight gain and type 2 diabetes. And it also leads to high blood pressure. And over time, it leads to plaque building up in our coronary arteries. It causes a lot of inflammation throughout the body as well. And we have a lot of people report that when they eliminate sugar and added sugars from their diet, they start having less aches and pains and joint pain. Insulin resistance is when we have so much glucose in the bloodstream and the insulin molecule isn't working to allow that glucose in the bloodstream to enter our cells. So we don't feel like we have energy. And so we eat more sugar to try to create energy, because we have that association that eating makes us have sugar in our blood and makes us feel good and vital. And because of that insulin resistance, that sugar doesn't enter our cells. So we feel low energy chronically. Another influence that sugar has on our metabolism is that it takes the size of our cholesterol particles, the LDL cholesterol, which is known as the quote unquote bad cholesterol, the cholesterol you don't want to have too much of, and it decreases the size of those particles. So our cholesterol starts going from something looking like the size of a beach ball. It's not quite that big, but just to give you the analogy, to something like the size of a little BB that goes into a BB gun. Why is that important? Is because when we get inflammation in the arteries, those smaller cholesterol particles can deposit themselves more easily along the lining of the artery. And that's when we start to develop plaque. So this is an important physiological change that eating a diet with too much added sugar leads to in the body. And one we want to be really mindful of monitoring in our own self is not just the level of LDL cholesterol that we have, but what is the size of those particles. When we think about sugar traveling through the artery, we can make the analogy to having sugar in your bloodstream is like having glass traveling through your bloodstream. And so over time, that tears the artery walls and makes the lining rougher. And as that lining of the internal artery gets rougher, there's more opportunity for inflammation. It swells up. And then those cholesterol particles, and especially if they've become too small, can deposit themselves and have like a stickiness to adhere to that lining of the artery. So that's kind of an extreme example, thinking of sugar as glass tearing up the inside of our arteries. But when we have too much of it and our blood sugar is too high chronically, it does create that inflammation in the lining of the heart arteries and the lining of the arteries that take the blood up to your brain, and all of those, and in the peripheral arteries in the legs and feet. So all of those arteries get inflamed and have the risk of forming plaque and forming blockages. So that's a really important consideration, is the level of inflammation that we know sugar creates. So over time, as those arteries start to get more inflamed, eventually that leads us to high blood pressure. And that is another important risk factor for heart disease. So when we look at the whole picture together, we know that too much added sugar in the diet leads to changes in our cholesterol profile. It leads to increased inflammation. It leads to insulin resistance, which then causes us to be more hungry and to eat more sugar, which leads to more weight gain and more inflammation, more oxidative stress, and high blood pressure. And that is a really negative feedback cycle that causes us to have low energy, causes us to gain weight, and causes us to continue to eat more. So while sugar and carbohydrates aren't the enemy, and while it is important to eat the healthy ones, you can have too much of a good thing, and it is a risk with all this added sugar in our diets. The history of nutrition and health is ancient. And what we know about the history of sugar and health is that, even our physicians in 500 BC were talking about how important food is for our health. Hippocrates, you may remember, coined the phrase, "Let food be thy medicine." And they would use food and herbs and potions to heal. And Hippocrates started talking about the importance of abundance of vegetables and fruit in the diet for good health. Both of these physicians lived in Greece and in that Mediterranean basin. And so when we think about food, we need to think, and we think about good nutrition, we need to be thinking about the quality of the food that we're eating. And we also need to be thinking about the quantity of the food we're eating. So at the level of quality, we need to think about, where is our food sourced and how far away is food from its original state. So I'd like to look at the example of whole grains. We hear a lot about whole grains now. Eat whole grains, they're really healthy for you, and that's a good carbohydrate. And what exactly is a whole grain, and how is that linked to quality? So a whole grain is a piece of grain that has all three parts of its original state intact. It has the part that's called bran, which is the outer shell. It has the endosperm, and it has the germ. And the bran and the germ are packed with vitamins and minerals and nutrients. And then you have the inside of that grain, which is more of the starchy carbohydrate with some protein and vitamins as well. But in that outer shell, you have things like vitamin B and vitamin E and phytochemicals, which are things that help with oxidation and inflammation. And with the advent of the flour mill in the Industrial Revolution, we were able to start refining grain. And so that grain would go through a process of being milled, and that outer layer and that inner germ would be stripped from the grain. And that is what makes a refined grain. So a refined grain has been processed. So it's moved away from its original state, and it's lost some of those really important nutrients. So whether we're thinking about a tomato that's been turned into ketchup by adding a lot of high fructose corn syrup and other preservatives and additives that have a long shelf life, or we're thinking about a whole grain being turned into a refined grain, that's all a level of processing that food is going through. And when we think about processing and processed foods, we want to eat the least processed foods as possible that have gone through the most minimum alterations to their original state. So examples of whole grains in our diet are things like wheat berries, oatmeal, quinoa, barley, brown and wild rice, and whole corn. And as they start getting transformed into white rice, and you take the example of bread, white bread, so that grain has been stripped down and refined, and then you add to it things like butter and salt and even additional sugars, and that becomes a processed grain. So as we're thinking about the grains that we're intaking into our body, and we're thinking about the quality of the food, we want to ask ourselves, how much has this food been altered from its original state? How much has it been processed? And how much preservatives and added sugars and high fructose corn syrup has been added to it? And then you're going to have a better sense of the quality of that food. What's also important about whole grains is that they have a lot and an abundance of micronutrients. So when we think about good nutrition, we want to think both about the quality and the quantity, and we want to be getting a lot of good quality micronutrients into our diet. And those are things that help fight inflammation and help make the body more sensitive to insulin and glucose, like berberine and other natural vitamins, minerals, and herbs. And so you also want to think about the proportion of carbohydrates and proteins and fats that you're eating. And there's not a one size fits all for everybody. Those portions and percentages of protein, fat, and carbohydrates that are important to mix into your food plan vary from individual to individual, and they vary in individuals. So sometimes people might find that they're doing better on a diet that is higher in carbohydrates and whole grain carbohydrates and lower in fat. And other times they might prefer to be on a diet that's higher in fat and protein and lower in carbohydrates. There's not a right or wrong answer about how much carbohydrate, how much protein, and how much fat should one be eating every day. But there is an answer of, amongst the types of carbohydrates that you're eating, are you eating the ones that are healthy and nutritious for you? Or are you eating the ones that are really working against you and your physiology? And so I personally like the Mediterranean diet, because the Mediterranean diet is really about high quality food and eating an abundance of non-starchy vegetables that have a lot of vitamins and minerals and antioxidants. So when I talk about a non-starchy vegetable, that's something like broccoli and green beans and kale and spinach and things that have simpler carbohydrates in them. It has an abundance of fruit in it. And it also has the nice, healthy carbohydrates like starchy vegetables, beets, artichokes, turnips, things that grow below ground, carrots, and it has whole grains in it. It also allows people to have lean proteins and nuts and healthy fats, as well as a wide range of things like avocados and olives, nut milks, and dairy to a minimal degree. And then within that Mediterranean diet, you can fluctuate whether you want to eat heavier on the healthy carbs and lower on the fats and protein side, or whether you want to eat higher protein and fat and less carbs. But what this diet is really about is giving people the therapeutic foods and an abundance of those really healthy vegetables and that are important for our diet. So certain people recommend 5 to 7 servings per day of fruits and vegetables. But if you really look at the cardiac literature, 7 to 9 servings of healthy fruits and vegetables per day is where you really start seeing a change in your risk profile for heart disease. Other examples of therapeutic foods are things like walnuts, chia seeds, ground flax seeds, avocados, and edamame. So these are in oily fishes that have a lot of omega. So these are all things that are part of the cardiometabolic food plan that we often like to recommend people follow, because they help support the body's healthy functioning. and really work on giving you an abundance of those healthy carbs. What we recommend within that is to we recommend individualizing how much carbs you're getting daily, but the carbs that you are getting, really making sure to get the healthy ones. Really limiting and moderating the amount of carbohydrates that have start to become more and more altered from their natural state, and really avoiding the carbohydrates that are drastically modified and altered. So I know this is a little bit repetitive from what I talked about before, but I think it's really important to really grow an awareness of that quality of food that you're eating and how much that food has been altered and how healthy it is, and really focus on those whole grains, whole vegetables and fruits, and getting plenty of those into your diet. The other thing that's so important to distinguish is fructose. So we hear a lot about fructose, and it's really healthy when fructose is in fruits because it comes with a lot of nutrients and antioxidants and minerals that you're getting alongside of that. It's when that fructose starts to become processed, altered, and made artificial, in the case of high fructose corn syrup, that it starts to become a problem. So really avoiding high fructose corn syrup is an added ingredient, is essential to health. As you're eating and looking at food labels and starting to gain more awareness of what you're putting in your body and how that's linked to your heart health, another very important consideration is trans fats. And trans fats are artificial fats. So we don't, they're not saturated fats. They're not unsaturated fats. They're a completely different classification of fats that are entirely man-made. And they exist in a lot of foods, including very popular kettle corn and other foods that taste good. And this is another part of the food label that I really encourage you to pay attention to. And we know that trans fats have a huge influence on insulin resistance and on inflammation. And these are another area as you're eating to be very mindful of. That often goes hand in hand with added sugars. So as you're looking at foods and thinking about what's in your pantry, paying attention to that is very important. Healthy sugar alternatives are things like coconut sugar. Coconut sugar is the same composition as table sugar as far as being, as far as its chemical composition, but what else is in there is other fiber and minerals and things that help process and digest that sugar. So it's a great alternative. Honey, you get a lot more sweetness out of a very little bit than you do from table sugar. Monk fruit is another example of a healthy sweetener, and stevia. And also what's important about these sugar alternatives is that if you're using them, you're probably cooking at home. And that means that you're less likely to be taking something that's already been made for you off the shelf where you don't exactly know what's in it. So as you're thinking about incorporating sweets and desserts into your diet, think about using ones that are more homemade and using some of these sugar alternatives. And also, as you're eating desserts, it's actually better to eat them with your meals or closer to your meals where you've also had fats and other foods that'll help slow down the absorption of those sugars. So those are just little tips for maintaining an aspect of pleasure in your diet, but trying to do it in a little bit more healthy way. Another favorite sugar alternative for people who have a sweet tooth and are looking for a dessert is dark chocolate, and picking a dark chocolate that has greater than 70% cacao in it. And, maybe mixing that with something like dried cranberries is healthy. So other hard advice that we have for you this month is really making sure to incorporate exercise into your daily routine, getting 30 minutes of moderate exercise at least 5 days a week. Sleep, the importance of link between sleep and weight is becoming more and more obvious for us. But what's interesting is that we see that both metabolic rate increases when people get proper night of sleep, and stress goes down. And when stress goes down, cortisol goes down, and cortisol will trigger our liver to produce its own sugar. So you don't even have to go out there and add sugar to your food to get sugar in your body, the liver is capable of making sugar. And the more stress that you have, the more cortisol you have, the more that triggers your liver to produce sugar. So we need to also support our body's healthy functioning and really make sure that we're managing our own stress. Other things that we can do to manage stress is meditation, gaining self-awareness through different exercises and coaching, well-being coaching, using cardiac coherence breathing, doing things like the infrared sauna, which will also help with blood pressure, and the salt room. Those are all great therapies and techniques to help reduce stress. If you smoke, really working on quitting that habit of smoking and really paying attention in your physical, to doing an annual physical, monitoring your blood pressure and your cholesterol levels. Specifically, if you have a risk or family history of heart disease, paying attention to not just the quantity of LDL cholesterol you have, but the size of those cholesterol particles, and working on your weight if you're overweight. So in addition to really following a healthy diet, these are some of the pillars that you can focus on for heart health. If you're looking for additional support, we're always very happy to provide that for you at POM, whether that's through your physician or through one of our programs. We have a fantastic new program at POM called the Balanced Living Program. It's a 12-week program that provides a lot of intensive support, weekly sessions with weigh-ins that help with accountability, following a food plan that's supported by a light menu in our cafe, as well as recipes for you to follow at home. And for people who struggle more with digestive issues, food sensitivity issues, energy, we have a precision nutrition program that includes a number of specialty labs, which may help you tailor a food plan better to your own specific individual preferences. So both the Balanced Living Program and Precision Nutrition Program are great options. The Precision Nutrition Program is available entirely virtually for people too. So that's a great program for people who travel a lot or who are out of state. And then for people who do have a risk for heart disease, really talking to your physician about Boston Heart Labs or there are other labs as well that look at more detailed analysis of your cholesterol, your particle sizes, and your inflammatory markers. And then, of course, really making sure that in your diet, you are incorporating plenty of omega-3 and curcumin and things that work on inflammation, in addition to eating really healthy whole grains. So, and whole fruits and vegetables. So those are the core components that I wanted to cover today. I'm happy to reach out if anyone has any individual questions, please reach out to one of our navigators, and I'm sure to get back to you on that. Have a great rest of your day, and it's been nice to spend this time with you.